Hello everyone, and welcome to this Uska News Water News video podcast. In November 2016, the first Global Water Stewardship Forum met in Scotland, the Hydro Nation, convened by the Alliance for Water Stewardship. Experts from more than 20 countries met in sunny Edinburgh for 2 full days with representatives from governments, large and small corporations, NGOs, finance and civil society. The forum was designed to advance global understanding and impacts of water stewardship and contribute to the further development of the global AWS Water Stewardship Standard. Uska News reported on the forum, and I had an opportunity to speak to several key participants. Ed Pinero, welcome to Edinburgh. Please describe yourself. Who are you and what brings you to this gathering?
Yeah, well, good morning. I'm very happy to be here. So my name is Ed Pinero. I am currently the president and founder of the Pinero Group, which is a water and sustainability consulting firm. Until recently, I was a senior vice president of sustainability for Veolia North America. My background, I'm an earth scientist and geologist by background. I have spent 35 plus years in sustainability and environmental issues. I have a strong background in standards development, which is also part of why I have been involved in this effort, and have been working on water stewardship from various different perspectives and working with different business sectors.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that Veolia was involved at a very early stage of development of the water standard that we're talking about so much this week. What was the business case for Veolia devoting resources for development of this standard?
Well, to put it into context, the reason I was working at Veolia and I had the role of a senior vice president for sustainability was a commitment to promoting cutting-edge innovation and best practices around water stewardship. So my job was to leverage my background in standard development and my background in water resources with Veolia's interests as an infrastructure service provider around water to be a leader in this space. Veolia saw the Alliance for Water Stewardship concept of the organization as well as the standard as one of the ways to move this forward. And part of the reason was the business value of a consensus-based international standard as a rallying point that everyone can understand what is required and what is meant, so we're all speaking a common language. So they saw the value in investing in this effort. So I actually participated on behalf of Veolia on the standard development committee that developed the standard. The goal being that by developing the standard and having it used, it would promote sustainable water practices and innovative water practices, which is the business space that Veolia was in. So it had also, in addition to wanting to be a leader in this and a thought leader in the area, clearly as a private for-profit company, Veolia saw also business development opportunities as part of being involved in this effort.
And this is the inaugural gathering of the Water Stewardship Forum. What are your hopes and expectations coming out of this event this week?
Yeah. Well, actually, I very happy to see this occur because it is showing we're to the point now where the standard has been published out there for 2 years. We're starting to see a growing interest in it. So what this forum allows is to bring the practitioners and those who have had experience already with it, that small population, together to share their experiences, but also now to introduce this to a whole new population of entities, both in the private sector and the public sector, to see the value of such a standard. I have worked on developing other standards, and they go through this evolutionary process where they have to be developed, published, and then there's a ramp-up period where people start to hear about it, learn about it, and understand why it could be useful. One of the things that this forum will help is to start to define what the drivers and the business case are for using the standard. And every stakeholder has a different view of how this can help them. This particular standard is in large part targeted towards large water users. When it was originally conceptualized, the primary user market was going to be industry that uses a lot of water. So clearly, for that to be successful to that primary target audience, it would have to make business sense. Because I think what people need to realize is, regardless of how committed an organization is to environmental stewardship, water stewardship, ecosystem restoration, unless you can invest the resources in doing that, it remains a concept and a commitment. It doesn't become real. But for private sector to be able to actually implement such practices, there has to be a way to build it into the business model, build it into the business case. So what I hope will come from this forum, and ideally the subsequent forums that will follow, is defining that business case, being able to show that this is not only good for, this is good for the environment, it's good for society, and it's good for the business, the longevity of the business itself, because that's really where they internally would be able to compete for the resources to be able to invest in getting this done.
So you developed many standards. It does seem to me, I'm not a water expert, I'm a water communications expert, but it must be so complex to begin to develop a standard that fits a power generation company, a food and beverage company, a transport company, and a mobile phone manufacturer. Where do you start?
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about international standards, whether it has to do with water or energy or whatever, you're looking for the ideal, optimal place where it is both general enough that it could apply around the world to all sectors, yet prescriptive enough that it actually has value, that it actually requires enough to make a difference. And that is always the challenge for standards writers. And that's why people wonder why a 10 or 12 page document takes 3 years to develop. And how can that be? Well, you're constantly trying to balance all of these interests. What I think was fantastic about the AWS process is the group of diversified stakeholders they pulled together to actually develop this document. There weren't very many of us on the committee, but we represented all sectors, private and public, civil society, NGOs from all over the world. So that allowed input from the very beginning to be cognizant of all of these interests. The other thing about consensus-based standards is that you go in with the understanding that it is consensus, not unanimity in terms of agreement on what it says, and that they are by definition compromises. There's a little bit for everybody, but not everybody's going to get everything that they want. And that's how these have to be developed. You also try to be careful to be prescriptive enough that it brings value to the organization, but not so prescriptive that you can't apply it in particular situations. And I think another place where the AWS standard has been very successful is that it has been able to define requirements for the process approach as well as water stewardship performance expectation in a way that it is clearly will improve an organization's water stewardship performance, yet not be so specific that a sector would say, well, I can't do that. That doesn't apply to me. Or somewhere in the world say, well, that doesn't apply in this area. I think it works on all of those fronts. But that's the issue of developing the standard. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story is how do you get raise the awareness and understanding of the standard so that people know what it's asking for. They can see clearly the value that it would bring to their organization. And then they see that the pathway to get there makes business sense and is something that they can kind of work towards. Those 3 steps: develop the standard that's applicable, understand what it's asking for, and make the case for implementation. I think that's the success journey that would have to occur.
That's what you describe as a ramp up.
Yes, that is the ramp up. And then what happens, it starts to feed on itself. So once you get a critical mass of interested players that are starting to look and implement the standard and build experience in how it works, lessons learned, case studies on successes that came as a result of doing this, then it will prompt more interest. And we have seen with other environmentally related management standards that growth curve becomes exponential at one point, where you might take a certain amount of time to get 10 to 100 implementers, but then the 100 to 1,000 becomes much faster, and so on.
What's an exemplar of?
Well, one of the best, most applicable examples, which actually is a standard that was used as the foundation for this one, and that is the ISO 14001 standard, the Environmental Management System Standard, published in 1996. Took several years to kind of raise awareness, but now the certifications around the world are measured in the tens of thousands. Many people know ISO 9000, the Quality Management System Standard. That's the lead building standard for building energy and environmental performance. These are all standards that have gone through very similar process of development, deployment, and uptake. So I am very optimistic that this standard will see at least that level of success, if not greater. And I think the reason I have higher hopes for this one is, unlike some of the other ones, this one is more inclusive of all the stakeholders. The explicit requirement to engage stakeholders in a collaborative manner for this standard to be, for someone to implement the standard, I think is stronger in this document than any of the other ones I have mentioned. And because of that, you have a whole population of interested parties and promoters of the concept that you normally don't see in some of these other very inside the fence line organization specific type standards. So from that standpoint, I have even higher hopes for this. So.
And the journey that we're on with the standard is part of the end game or later game going to be consumer-facing messaging, something like fair trade coffee?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about these types of standards that deal with organizational management as compared to a product, you know, when you talk about the forest stewardship type standards, for example, they deal with not only the management of the forest, but they talk about the product itself. When you talk about product labeling and product stewardship as compared to organizational management, it gets a little bit tricky with standards, because if you're going to label a product as AWS certified, the product itself is not AWS certified, it's the organization that developed it. Right. So we have to get to a point, and it's doable, and I think this is something that is part of the evolutionary process, where there will be a way for companies to make that declaration that they are AWS certified. How many different ways they can do that has to evolve. You know, the easy initial way is notices on websites and press releases and so on. But getting to the point where that's actually on the company's products, if they have a consumer-facing product, has to be kind of worked out. Not impossible, but that's part of the future. We have to remember that we are just about a little over 2 years into the life of this standard. Which in standards speak is in infancy still, in terms of market awareness, market uptake, and so on. So all of these issues, product labeling and consumer messaging, management of the certification, renewals of certifications, and all these kind of things will be worked out. And again, I commend AWS for moving so quickly through this. Having worked in this space for over 2 decades, the speed at which the standard was conceptualized, developed, published, and then the infrastructure set up around it to manage it, you know, to manage implementations, to certify trainers, certify auditors, manage the label, the actual brand of being AWS certified. All of these things that are either already developed, already established, or very well along the way of being established. 2.5 years in is really quite extraordinary compared to how long it takes to get these things done normally. So I'm very optimistic, very optimistic.